Hi everyone, we're here another week at Mutant Watch, and I'm really excited about the topic of today and about the guests that we have. We're going to talk about Magneto. We're going to go through his life, his ideals, his story, background, etc. We're going to talk everything that we can about Magneto, and we have like three really Magneto enthusiasts here today. We have Erik Ojo, who has a really incredible video that I recommend that I will put later in comments about Magneto and mental illness, that I think it's amazing. We have Dani Kinney, who is a writer for Women's Rights About Comics and also has written some very interesting articles about trans issues and about mutant metaphor issues also that I recommend very much. And we have Sasha Kaplan, who is one of the writers for Comic Watch and has been reviewing the Trial of Magneto miniseries, and also I pretty much recommend going to her page as well and to her Twitter, Geeky Kaplan. And we have the usuals here, and Duna, Travis Scott is with us today, and we're gonna rock it.
This week on Mutant Watch.
Okay, first question for all of you, and this is a heavy one, but I want to ask you all why you connect with Magneto, what Magneto means to you, and I think it's a good way to start some of the other conversations that we're going to have. I don't know if anyone wants to go first.
I guess I'll start us off. Well, I'm Jewish. In case anybody who has read my blog or my Twitter don't know about, I blog a lot about Jewish issues and Jewish representation. And so seeing Magneto, who's a character that is so associated with something as huge and as impactful to the Jewish community as the Holocaust, is just incredible. And even though we'll get into, like, I think later on the kind of issues of representation that come up with Magneto, I think having a character that is so complex and who is a Holocaust survivor is so important. And I'm at a point in my life where I'm just a little desperate for any shred of Jewish representation I can get to a degree. So it's nice to be able to talk about a character who is so Jewish in so many ways.
I guess I'll go next. Whose cat was that?
Sorry, she's gonna do that, unfortunately.
I love that. You love cats here. But basically, I mean, my name is Eric, so that's like I guess an explanation of how deeply I connect with Magneto. But I think I relate to him both in like a personality-wise way, but also in a way that the personality and like feelings about activism and social issues kind of like mesh. Like I relate a lot to feeling very like intensely about social issues in general, but the ones that impact me specifically as a marginalized person, and also like fielding some kind of like shame or silencing from other people for that. I think that was like something that really connected with me. I think the first time that I got into X-Men, / first time I saw Magneto when I was watching X-Men First Class, about like just like just like kind of like being seen as like the crazy person in the room when you're the only one making sense. Just yeah.
I'll go next. I think my first connection, and this is going to be the first of many shots that I fire today. The biggest draw to Magneto at first for me was really like the abjection I felt towards Xavier's politics. And I'm talking about like Xavier in sort of the like general cultural narrative around Xavier, because I think that there are a lot of there are a lot of runs that really do build on that nuance, but I think that he's somebody that names the unnamed experience of a lot of minorities. And I think like the scene that really locked it in for me is tragically housed within like a mess of a movie. So in X-Men Last Stand, where he is in the church meeting with the Morlocks, and he like gets up and he just goes on this like really eloquent rant about the way that we like create silence as a shroud for like mass forms of oppression. And I was just like, as young as I was like, damn, that like there's something in there that speaks to me. And the more I got involved with like local political organizing, I kept finding myself like really immersed in like really like radical anti-fascist organizations. And so he really represents a challenge to respectability politics, which, you know, like I believe that respectability politics comes with a body count a lot of the times. And I feel so much of his intensity where it's just like, no, we cannot pilot on this way. We have to really take up space and hold space and not be afraid of labels like militant and extremist, terrorist. But I also think like he represents a really interesting model of like minority stress in comics, which like as a trans person in the US is like very normalizing to be like, yeah, I would throw a comet at this planet too if I could, probably at some point.
Well, I think he's also representing kind of what you were saying, that frustration of, I guess, being marginalized and being oppressed and not having the power, quote unquote, to really make a difference. And the fact that, you know, he is a representative of, you know, a couple of different minorities himself, being a mutant, being Jewish. He's sort of like that voice against anti-Semitism of like, hey, we've been beaten around for a couple of, you know, several centuries now. Maybe it's time to like fight back. And so it's interesting also like comparing how different writers write that aspect of him from, you know, Claremont to more recent runs.
Well, I think, you know, anyone who's coming from a background where genocide is not that far back, where it is, you know, within living memory, you feel an association with the things that he has to be dealing with, regardless from even the fantastic elements. When you look back at the original run, even, they're positioning him both as, you know, Kirby and Lee are positioning him both as a mutant and as a very clear Nazi metaphor. His soldiers in that original run are not mutants for the most part. He's got a small band of mutants and a bunch of human soldiers that are there being paid, and they're conquering South American nations. They're going to the savage land and experimenting on, you know, quote unquote, lesser forms of human being. And in the context of a Magneto who is a Holocaust survivor, who is an old man, and the further we get in time with Magneto still being tethered, he's an old man. He's been through a lot. He's seen a lot. So you have to, you know, take that into account. It becomes, for me, not only if I had the power, we could do this, but also we do have power and there's a limit or a frame that we have to exist in with that power.
Just hammering in that great power and great responsibility, but in everything.
I grew up with, you know, AIM was still going strong when I was young. And that was, you know, you see the good in AIM, you see good people that worked with AIM that are still proud of that still work with those, you know, organizations and those causes. I grew up with Workers' World, and at the same time, you see those things and you see people who had good intentions or who had a good plan, and either they cut corners or they reacted emotionally or there's other circumstances. And I think that's very relatable to me. not in a I will never be that person way, but it's very easy to be that person way.
It's really easy to be Magneto. And I think that's the excitement. I think that he holds a lot of potential for like marginalized communities to like live out a power fantasy that we just don't have access to sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's also like part of like why I guess Krakoa era, like for all its like missteps, is like so like powerful and like really like has excited a lot of X-Men fans recently, because I feel like you do get the power fantasy in a way from X-Men, proper, that we've had for quite a while now, but actually being in power in this kind of way, we haven't really seen for X-Men at all, or at least like for a stretch of time. Like, for instance, yeah, Genosha was there for 2 seconds, and I guess Utopia failed, I guess.
But like even with Genosha and Utopia, you get the sense constantly that it's always temporary. And that, every 5 minutes, somebody's out there trying to destroy or nuke or dismantle or attack. And it's just like there's never a moment when they just get to like be. So I have some mixed feelings on Krakoa personally, but I see where you're coming from, and I think that's a really good way to look at it. And I think now this is where like, okay, so now we get to actually explore what this means for this community and how this plays out. And now it's like its own society that is like protected. But then that makes me wonder, did the writers sort of write themselves a little bit into a corner there? So, but we'll see what happens. This is still relatively new. It's only been 3 years, which is like 2 seconds in comic book time.
So, okay. So for me, piggybacking a little bit on things Dani and Erik said, I think one of the things that really like drives me to Magneto is also like the fact that a lot of Marvel comics have like very assimilationist politics, and politics that regards very heavily on how you appear to people that have power over you, which makes sense, especially as time develops, it starts to be more of a big company, and it starts to appeal more to like, assimilationist ideas. And I feel like Magneto is such a strong and clear anti-assimilationist approach that sometimes goes to the point of like caricature or like too much, or not too much, but like, you all get me. And I think that's one of the things that called me a lot. That is one of the, you don't have to be or to behave a certain way to be worthy of just existing. I think that message is like there of like, you have to take into your hands to do everything you can for like your and your people's existence. And I think that's part of like what really drove me there. And okay, second question I have for you all is if there's any particular run that you connect with Magneto more, any particular moment of his history, and any recommendations you have, for example, for someone that has never read anything, for example, or only find him not through his media that is more focused on him.
There's so many moments. It's hard to pick, like even if you Google right now, like Magneto reading list, you're going to get so many different suggestions. Off the top of my head, I can think of 3. We'll go in chronological or in publication order. The first is Uncanny X-Men 200, which I actually have owned and framed in my apartment. Which is, Magneto coming to trial, and then Magneto facing, his identity is revealed, and he's actually facing real consequences for his actions. And this sets off a period where Erik is not the bad guy, where he actually goes through some reform. He bonds with Kitty Pryde more, who is like the other very Jewish X-Men character. The second I have is X-Men Magneto's Testaments, which if you have not read that, you have to. It's 5 issues. It is one of the best representations of the Holocaust in a comic book form since Mouse. which chronicles Magneto's childhood as a Holocaust survivor. And like the first issue just kills me every time because it's like little Erik growing up in Germany, and he gets sent home because he's just been kicked out of school because he's Jewish, and then he gets beaten up like 2 seconds later, and it's just like this. It's just like it doesn't like it's just this. It's such an accurate and such an important conversation to have because Holocaust education around the world is terrible. And then my final one, I'm actually looking at the poster, is actually Avengers: The Children's Crusade, because my last name Kaplan is not my real last name, it's my pen name. I took it from the best superhero in the entire Marvel universe, Billy Kaplan, aka Wiccan. And Children's Crusade is about the journey of finding the Scarlet Witch post House of M, and it features a somewhat softer side of Magneto, which we don't often see, that set off a whole chain reaction within fandom, and he's been dumped Grampneto. Which is just hilarious, and I love it so much. But I love the softer side of Magneto because at the end of the day, he does care about people. He's not always very good at showing it, but he does care. And the interactions that he has with the Young Avengers, this ridiculous group of absolutely amazing superheroes, is hysterical. And every interaction that he has, from Billy to Eli to Kate, is just, it's so different. And each time you're like, they've just adopted their oldest member, and it's hilarious. And there's some mistakes along the way, but it's such a fun run. And Magneto is both a protective father, a awkward grandfather, and then still himself. It's a great combination.
Yeah, I feel like Magneto's softer side, like especially like comes out like with like his kids are just like young mutants in general, like definitely almost like a Wolverine factor. It's great.
Well, there is that. What was it? Sorry to interrupt. There was this one. I can't remember if it was in the Pride issue or not, but there's one moment where he's like meeting with Bobby Drake, A.K.A. Iceman, and it's just so wholesome.
Yeah.
And he just wants to give this poor kid a hug because he needs it.
Yeah.
I
So
love
that's
it.
actually that
We
was
have the writer of that story on the chat. Like,
Hi,
we
Anthony.
have
Thank you so
Anthony
much.
Oliveira here. I was gonna say it one time or another. I didn't know when, but we have Anthony in the chat. So yeah, the writer of that really beautiful story.
Thank you for the Jewish representation and the Wicked and Hugling tie-in. It was beautiful.
So that issue, or that story within the Pride issue, is actually what, because I was thinking about this question, and like the biggest advice I can give anyone who wants to understand Magneto is know that like whatever the run is that you read first, you are likely to read like whatever happens before or after, and it's a completely different character. You got to just ride the chaos wave. Magneto is where continuity for characterization goes to just perish, because like you've got folks out there like Morrison who are just like, yeah, let's see what we can do if like we just make Magneto like the best asshole possible in the universe. And it's but anyway, circle back to Anthony's story. Like when I think about like what is quintessential about that character, I think about exactly what that story gives us, which is like, yes, this is the Magneto who is going to attack the Xavier Mansion with rockets. That's a given. But like when like Magneto's bottom line is he wants mutants to be okay. And like that's what he cares about. And so going from that like grandiose display of power to this like really raw display of power in how he like personally connects with and advocates for Bobby in that moment, it shows such an awareness of like that character's interiority that like so many writers forget about, where it's like sometimes he knows that it's throwing missiles, sometimes he knows that it's like threatening the governments of the earth with depolarizing the planet, but sometimes it's just sitting with a like confused queer mutant who needs an elder. And I think that like if you want to know why people love Magneto so much, that is the story. And like I feel like every time I come on this podcast, I always end up gushing over Anthony's work. I'm not sponsored or anything, but I think that story is like, it's beautiful, and it's like it's also one of the best Magneto stories, I think, and it's like 6 pages long.
Yeah.
it's like it's a haiku about the character in like the best way.
Mhm.
I'm gonna plug one of Anthony's comments real fast, just because we have Anthony Oliveira here. Like, thank you, Anthony. But okay, for real.
So I think,
Hmm.
for me, Magneto is a much better tool in a way than he is a character, because the characterization is all over the place.
Yeah.
But I love back in the day in the original Secret Wars, which is not a deep thinking comic whatsoever. You have very clear heroes, you have very clear villains, and then you have the X-Men and Magneto is not a hero or a villain in that. He's a mutant. That's what it comes down to. They are a complete community, separate, and they're aware, and the non-mutant characters are aware they are a separate community, and they really handle their own shit separate from everybody else, which is true of the comics, because comics focus even in a shared world. But I think that's the first time I saw it where it was clear that it was a conscious choice of a community. And that really reflects, in the real world, that's how you deal with it. There are people in your community that you may not like, that you may disagree with, that may be atrocious human beings or whatever, but you handle it in community. It's different for everybody else out there. They can deal with it themselves. And so I find Magneto in that way to be very useful. The story in the Pride issue doesn't really jibe with a lot of how Magneto was represented in the era that it's set in. It doesn't matter. It works wonderfully in that story. It's important in that story. Also in the 80s, in the Vision and Scarlet Witch series, when Magneto is revealed as their father and he comes down. And I love that because it's not like people keep saying, like I keep saying, why don't they have a Christmas special for Vision and Scarlet Witch? They should have a Christmas special. And I love that in that series that it takes place over a year, and it's very clearly a winter moment, but it's not a Christmas moment at all. There's no Christmas tree. There's no Christmas decorations. There's no our Lord and Savior, the one true God, blah, 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 which even in stories that try to not be Christian sometimes dip into. They can't help themselves. And it doesn't do that. And Magneto comes down and he's just like, he's a guy. Magneto, in so many representations, wants to be the dad, even when he's not somebody's father.
And when he's not even doing a good job of it either.
He's a terrible father, but he wants to be. I love there's a What If issue by Claremont where he's talking to Charles and Gabby Holler, and he's obviously older than Charles, especially as time goes by. He's getting older and older, and Charles is staying, the same. Charles, 45 years old or whatever, and looks like he's 80. But he's talking to Charles and he's talking to Gabby Holler, and he's like, when you get to be my age and have my experience, and Gabby Holler tells him, we're the same age. And it's such a beautiful moment, but I think Magneto thinks of himself as the elder statesman. He thinks of himself as the dad at all times. Even when he's showing up with a bunch of bombs to, throw missiles at school or whatever.
Sounds like my dad.
Well, there's a great moment in Uncanny X-Men where the X-Men are fighting Magneto and Kitty's there. And this is like, Kitty's just like, she's 13 years old and she gets hurt. And Erik just stops everything and he goes, oh God, this is a child. What am I doing? And that's like, that I think is what you're trying. Like, that just was the first thing that popped into my head when you started saying that.
Yeah. There are just so many good stories. I would definitely just say so many Claremont things. Like, in a lot of ways, it's almost as if Magneto is Claremont's character, though he was not created by Claremont really, but like the way that he changed Magneto, like irreversibly, like changed like his entire trajectory forward. Even when people were taking him in complete different, areas, like he'd like set the stage. So I think like definitely any of those stories that y'all mentioned by Claremont would be amazing, like for anybody who doesn't know Magneto, and definitely Magneto Testament. Like I think it's I think like just like that, like the Vision and Scarlet Witch issue, like how he's just like a guy. I feel like Testament has this side, like it shows Magneto as a child, and I think like seeing him like that and seeing him in this way is something that is like um missing from a lot of stories. And I think it's like important to see for a whole host of reasons, but I think it's like important to see the entire picture. I guess almost in the way that both of the X movie series opened with Magneto as a child in Auschwitz. The importance of that for Magneto, but honestly, so much of X-Men. And I guess uh like I'm trying to like think, but I guess Cullen Bunn's run, I'm saying his name. And also I really like how how he was written in Hickman's X-Men 2019. I thought that was really fun, and I loved like the kind of like interactions he had with like younger X-Men members, like the Cuckoos. I mean, just with like all the mutant kids. I just felt like it really highlighted like all those things that like deep down Magneto like really feels about what he really wants. Like he wants happiness for mutants, and he really, really just wanted to be a father at the end of the day.
Well, and I love, with the Morrison run, clearly Magneto dies in it, and he is an asshole, and he's trying to be the best villain he can be because he thinks that's what people want out of him. But prior to that breakdown, when he's teaching, when he's pretending to be Zorn and he's a teacher, he's a really good teacher. The same thing with New Mutants when Louis Simonson was writing New Mutants. And Simonson was not really on board with Magneto is a great guy, the way that I think Claremont was trying to push for. He's doing some dodgy stuff in that New Mutants run, but he's a good teacher. He's good to the kids. He falls short. People fall short. But in both of those runs, it shows that if a lot of other stuff wasn't going on in the world, he could just settle down and work with kids, and he'd probably be really great at it.
Definitely. I think one of the things that is also interesting about Magneto is that unlike a lot of other villains, he does have a limit, and he does have, well, I guess it all depends on who's writing at the moment, but he does have a line that he doesn't cross. And one of those best lines is, I think there's a moment where he actually ends up being on a team with other supervillains. And one of those villains happens to be the Red Skull. And at first he's like, wait a minute, you can't possibly be the same Red Skull. And then he realizes that it is the same Red Skull. And then he's just like, nope, I'm out and I'm going to beat the crap out of you. And I was looking at the panel from Captain America 367 where this all takes down, and Magneto actually he traps the Red Skull in a bunker to just wallow and die. And I'm like, this is perfection, and I need it. And it was just such an epic moment. And I think that was written by Mark Grunwald and with art by Kyron Dwyer. It was amazing.
In second place is the moment where Magneto smashes the Red Skull's head with a cinder block.
Yes. On par.
Which is... Go. You go.
Can we pause for a moment and just a little sidetrack from that, but can we talk for a moment about how comfortable the X-Men are with former Nazis? Because it's
Mr. Sinister.
Super weird. Dr. Nemesis, Mr. Sinister, they're really okay with this stuff.
It truly, trying to find the nicest words I can say.
I mean, look, they have people like Sinister, and they had Apocalypse for a while on the Quiet Council, and you're just like, one of these things just doesn't belong here.
Yeah. It's like,
but
I just don't understand. I feel like in the amount of time that's passed, why hasn't there been really, meaningful discussion or something to happen? Story with conflict, good, but it's very big issue that has not been addressed, and it's
and that's the
you
most
guys
frustrating thing.
I think what was it? There was one comic very recently came out that basically had Emma and Erik talking. I don't remember what it was. I'll have to look it up and come back to it. But the basic gist of it was that they both agreed that Nathaniel Essex, A.K.A. Sinister, is a cancer on Krakoa. And I'm like, took you long enough.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like there are certain characters who would just never shut up about this. And Magneto is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like Magneto would take advantage of the resurrection protocol on Krakoa to off Fenris and Sinister, at least like on a weekly basis, just so that like they know. Like,
yeah.
And
Magneto
I feel like
calling for Cortez when he's reborn in the meeting. That was so much relief from me, because Cortez's entire defense is that he's not a part of this community. He holds his community in disdain. He is descended from the great conquerors of ancient Europe, and they fire him. And to me, that's a lot more Magneto to me than I think, unfortunately, a lot of Krakoa Magneto has been.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mentioned earlier that I had some issues with how like Erik's been written recently, and we'll hopefully, if we have time to get into that, we can. But the comic where with Emma and Magneto that I mentioned was actually, I think, an issue of Hellions from this past December. So we'll see if that goes anywhere, because we all know threads in comics don't always come to fruition.
Yeah.
I feel like Hoxpox Magneto made a promise that everything sin's really kind of, I don't know, this is personally how I felt about it, but like when I was reading House of X and Power, well, really just House of X, it felt like there was going to be an acknowledgement that like Krakoa was going to be Erik's way. That like Xavier had finally realized that like maybe peaceful coexistence is not necessarily in the best interest for a group of like intersectionally marginalized folks. And maybe we should look at being visible and taking up space and affirming those boundaries. And then like everything since has really like, it hasn't contradicted that, but I don't feel like they really plowed deep enough into like a mutant separatist nation with Magneto at like a figurehead position. I feel like should be saying a lot more things than the kind of like vanilla takes that it has kind of provided since like a really bold opening shot.
And I feel like it's almost like in being separatist, like I feel like it doesn't care enough about the people, like the outside world, because I feel like not like the outside world in terms of humans, but the outside world in terms of mutants who are not in Krakoa, can't come to Krakoa for whichever reason. I feel like there would have been more of that if we were like thinking of this in a kind of like Magneto, Genosha 2 kind of situation.
Right. Genosha had a street team. They had a recruitment and marketing plan. Like Krakoa is just like, if you can find a gate, good fucking luck.
I think with Krakoa, I feel like they were relying a lot on like the free press angle free publicity angle, because everybody made such a big deal about these gates that are popping up everywhere. That got a lot of free publicity. There was even this whole thing where like Magneto gave the various diplomats from around the world a tour of Krakoa. And there's this whole like, oh, we're going to share our like magical flowers and tech with you. And it was like, okay, well, this is interesting. Can we explore this a little bit more? No, we're just gonna, okay, all right. We're just gonna have Magneto basically renouncing his entire Jewish identity in the holiest place for Jews in the entire world. Okay, sure. We're not gonna touch that at all or develop it or explain that.
Yeah. Sasha, feel free to expand on that if you want. Like, you don't have to wait.
No,
you
okay.
can,
So
right?
my issue with a lot of Magneto, and I've ranted about this on my own podcast, Nerdy Notions, when I reviewed all of the X-Men films, is that Magneto is a Holocaust survivor, right? He is a character whose experience, because he's Jewish, is so traumatic, and this formulates a lot of his identity and his views. Except with the exception of like, you know, a handful of comics, the fact that he's Jewish is very rarely stated. Like, look at the X-Men films. The fact that he's Jewish is actually never mentioned once. And like, I get the whole show don't tell thing. This is going to be a rant. I'm sorry. I get show don't tell, but it's not a crime to explain I'm Jewish, this is me. Like the closest moment we got was in that scene in X-Men First Class in Argentina, which is to me the greatest scene in cinematic history, right? Where he says, "Oh, my parents didn't have names. Their names were taken from them by, pig farmers and tailors." And it's just so satisfying to watch. But you have a character whose Jewish identity doesn't exist outside the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And it only comes up when we need to talk about the Holocaust. And regardless of whether or not Erik believes in God or whether or not he's religious or practicing, he's still Jewish. Being Jewish is not a pure religious identity. It's an ethno-religious identity. So it doesn't matter if you didn't grow up your entire life going to temple. You're still Jewish. And to have Erik, who's one of the most known Jewish characters in all of comic books, to stand in Jerusalem and deny his humanity, right, to these people and these politicians in Jerusalem is not just a denial of humanity. That's effectively a denial of his Jewish identity. And not gonna lie, that was very, that hurt me. And that was just physically, I had a visceral reaction. I was like, oh God, really? And it felt a little, and obviously it wasn't on purpose, but it felt a little insulting and it felt a little unnecessary. Whereas you didn't have to remind us that Magneto doesn't like humanity. We already knew this. We have 70 years of continuity that already tells us that. So that's the end of that for now.
Krakoa has no intersectionality. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It refuses to let anyone share any community except you're a mutant, you're a mutant, you're a mutant. And if there's anything else to it, it has to be cut out, which is nuts and dangerous. And I think a horrible message. I can't imagine myself, if this was all real and I was a mutant, looking at Krakoa, looking at their government, looking at their rhetoric, looking at their setup, and being like, absolutely, I'm going to leave my homeland and my community and I'm going to go join that because maybe I'll get a house, and that's kind of what's left over. They gave all the good stuff to people already. Blob has the only bar in the country. Okay? There's one singer in the country and they're all white people. That's who got stuff. When I first started to read Hoxpox, and I remember Sebastian Shaw, who had no business being there whatsoever. He had no money. He had no power. Nobody liked him. Not only did they give him a government seat, but his first question was, what about land rights? How much can I charge for rent? He wants to be a land baron immediately. And they're like, oh, absolutely. We'll talk about that. I can't imagine voluntarily sacrificing all identity, all cultural identity, all community to go join that because I'll get good health care and maybe a house. It's not worth it.
And it's interesting that this is something that would be really cool to explore within the confines of Krakoa, right? What about mutants that are very religious? Nightcrawler, the Way of X had so much potential, right? To really explore religious identity because Kurt is one of the strongest and most religious characters in comics, right? So they were sort of hinting at that, and it's sort of like they were afraid to go down in that direction. And he didn't even really interact with any other religious characters to have that conversation of well, the answer is just okay, we're gonna create our own religion. I'm like, but what if nobody? what if I don't want to join your religion? What if I'm perfectly happy with my religion?
Yeah. I feel like I was trying to do too much at once. I feel like the concept of religion itself on Krakoa is big enough to fill up an entire run. You didn't have to add the Onslaught thing onto it, even though Onslaught's interesting, but this is more interesting. We need this kind of depth in Krakoa.
I think there's just also a little bit too much going on with the X-Men comics as a whole. There's just too many titles.
It's not consolidated enough. They're all in completely different places, and while it's very fun, it's just, I don't know, maybe start smaller than branch out. Because I feel like the X-Men 2019 was doing a lot of the heavy lifting, or maybe just all of the early runs were doing heavy lifting and world building, then after a certain point, that world building kind of just like tapered off, and I feel like needed more of that.
Yeah, there's still a lot that just doesn't make sense about Krakoa.
I think, with Krakoa, especially culturally, politically, the writers and the architects sometimes forget that it's not America. With Magneto, I think very often it's forgotten that he's not American. His political outlook, his approach to things culturally should not be American. And so with Krakoa, especially, the way that they set up the expectations for things, how it's going to work, we're just going to assign a religion. We're just going to assign, that sort of, and even with Genosha, I mean, they had a national anthem and they had to sing it in school every day and that sort of thing. So there are things that he's approaching that are certainly nationalistic, and he's comfortable with that, Magneto, but it's different than the way that Krakoa is set up like it's like some little town in the Midwest that just happens to have all the mutants and free healthcare. And it shouldn't work that way. He should be offended by these things. The fact that the council has these genocidal figures on it, but also you've got genocidal figures, you've got the, Charles Xavier, Jean Grey side of it, and then you've got Kurt, and I love Kurt, I love Nightcrawler, but they picked for that council one of the biggest Catholics of all mutants to not only be on the council, but then to be like in charge of religion and in charge of philosophy. And that's weird. That should set some flags off for people like Magneto and a lot of other characters. And because the different titles have different writers and they're doing their own thing, we don't really get that sense. There hasn't been a title whose job is just to show clapback on things. And maybe we should have one. Maybe Magneto should have one, where it's just like Magneto's opinion on everything else in the books. One of the titles that I like in a lot of ways was Excalibur, but Excalibur opens up with them hunting and killing the werewolves, who are intelligent, humanoid in a mental way. They're aware, they can talk, they have opinions, they're living things. They're hunted down and killed for a magical spell. And their defense is, well, living on Earth, they've got brain damage. So if you have brain damage, it's totally cool to hunt you down and kill you. And this is somehow a weird metaphor for fox hunts, which are totally cool and not destructive and elitist. And just all of those levels, I was like, I have severe problems as a Native person who's disabled with the idea that any of that is okay. And Magneto has been in a coma. Magneto has had brain damage before. Magneto still has memory issues canonically with that. Magneto is bipolar canonically. Magneto has been through the Holocaust. It feels really weird that he had no problem with royalists and genocidal people getting together and being like, well, we're going to have a fox hunt for intelligent aliens, but it's cool because they got brain damage.
I feel like the Krakoa era is really just like Magneto having had his edges sanded off. Like, it is, Magneto is as polished and pristine as Pepe Larraz's art. And I don't mean that in a great way. I mean, like, everything that made that character interesting and dynamic and would cause friction with all of the things that are taking place on Krakoa have been like painted over by Disney because, like, this is like Disney's X-Men. And like, we are seeing this, like, it's a very steady simmer of X-Men politics in like a really like not in a good way. It's in a way where it's taken like all of the characters who like should be at boiling points with things. Like Magneto should be taking. Magneto has never allowed himself to be as small in a group of mutants as he has, I think, on Krakoa. And I mean, fortunately, there's a current series out that is focusing specifically on Magneto.
We'll see what happens with that.
Yeah.
Well, when you said When you said that, I thought you meant sword. Like, I didn't even think of the other one.
I mean, I'm also interested about what happens when you take Magneto and put him on the red planet, because you're
Yeah.
further. I mean, I think that there's so many angles of things that could have been really interesting, but like ultimately Magneto has just been like, he's not recognizable for any of the things that I think we know him as like a political, like as a politically active member of the mutant community. And that's been like largely,
Well,
there
I
have
mean,
been a lot of
what does he do on Krakoa? He drinks tea and he
It's a great
moves large
question.
objects for people.
He
That's
complains
weird.
to the council. He does that.
which
Yeah.
you know,
There were cases where there was one, I think it was during Powers of X or House of X at some point, but basically Xavier and what's her name, Moira, come to Magneto and they're like, we should probably like kill, I think it was Destiny or something. And he was like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. And you're not going to use me to do that because you can't figure out a different way. And so I hope that this new X-Men title is going to be Erik getting his groove back. Because it
Yes.
seems like a lot of things have happened on Krakoa recently, especially with Trial of Magneto. And these little things in like Way of X, in Helions, that will hopefully get to Erik actually realize like, oh, this is not going the right way. And he goes like, my ideal, in an ideal universe, Magneto's going to leave Krakoa and go on a journey of self-discovery where he just teams up with a whole bunch of Jewish superheroes. And you know, and it's just like, it's going to be a journey of self-discovery and identity. And he comes back and he's like, Krakoa, we need to fix some stuff. But that's in a perfect world.
Did any of you read the Brotherhood when that came out in the early 2000s title?
No.
Okay. It is terrible. It was by a mystery writer who was known as X, who has now been outed. It's about, this was pre 9/11, so edgy terrorism stuff was very cool and very in for 5 seconds. And it is about the most white bread middle class mutants deciding that Magneto has gotten old and settled down now that he has Genosha, and they're bringing it back real. And it's like super edgelord stuff. And I can't really tell how much of that was meant to be serious, how much of that was an aging writer trying to prove they still had it in them. But it is the most atrocious comic. And unfortunately, a lot of Krakoan politics remind me consistently of the Brotherhood. And this is what marginalized communities look like to people who are not from marginalized communities.
I would almost shudder at the idea that Krakoa has a political side. Like, I think that a lot of the politics of Krakoa are read into it by fans and readers and critics. But like in terms of like what's on the page, I have yet to feel like this, like the Utopia era was more politically minded, I think, than Krakoa was. But that's my hot take.
They started running drugs into African countries who didn't want them and created a CIA before they created a healthcare program or a home check program or even a murder investigation program. So
I should say there are politics. What I meant is like there is.
Yeah.
I haven't felt like there has like been a cohesive political system developed.
No, there's no like cohesive political message at all. I think they just adopted the edgiest aspects of a political regime that they could think of. We're isolationist. We have a CIA. We're coming to your country whether you like it or not. They just kind of took this edgelord position in politics.
We're going to take mutants from their homes, whether they really want to be taken or not, and take them to to totally not Genosha 2.0.
I fully believe that there are people working on the X books right now who don't think the Pretender or the Pretenders is in any way a political term. And, you know, with Native community right now, we have some people who are making very active efforts to decry entire tribes of people, entire nations of people as not appropriate or not right, to go after Black Native people, to go after people that are mixed. And so for me, when I see that Pretender stuff, that's the sort of thing that comes up immediately to me. is that they don't like people that are too dark to be Indian. They don't like people that are Indian from a part of the North America that they're not comfortable with, or a part of South America they're not comfortable with. But I feel very, you know, not like in a malicious way. I'm not saying, oh, these terrible writers, these terrible artists, but I feel like there are writers and artists on X Books right now who would say and mean it that the Pretender thing it's a fictional thing or it's a fantasy thing.
But here's the thing. Comic books have always paralleled the real life, and real life sometimes parallels the comics. And so you can't really just, you know, put on some rose-colored glasses and look at it only within an in-universe perspective. And it's interesting that you brought that up, because I remember thinking, like, in universe wise, when they started calling Wanda the Great Pretender, and I'm like, that implies that she actively decided to pretend to be a mutant. I'm like, why would you actively decide? It reminds me, there's a comedian named Elon Gold, and he was talking about converting to Judaism. And he's like, we're the only religion that doesn't try to convert people. And so a lot of us like, can you just imagine that recruitment poster? Like, do you crave persecution? Like, do you want to give up the greatest foods in the world, bacon cheeseburgers and double bacon cheeseburgers, right? So when I read that in Wanda, my first reaction was like, why would she, like, it sort of implies that she actively chose to pass herself off as a mutant. I'm like, for what? The perks? Like, what is the perks here?
Well, I mean, and Franklin is like 8, right? Franklin's like 8, 10 years old. He's a little kid.
I think he's older now. He's like meant to be like 14, 15-ish because he just got his license.
Okay, so even so,
age in comics is weird, all right?
You're like 14 and you're being told like you subconsciously chose to be a oppressed minority as when you were 2, so it's your fault now at 14. That's like,
oh, and because you don't have powers anymore, you're not a real mutant, so you're not welcome, and you can't sit with us anymore. Like it's like Mean Girls level pettiness.
Mhm.
And also, I feel like
go on.
No, I feel like with Wanda specifically, there's definitely also some anti-Romani racism in the whole Pretender thing, and I feel like that's something that writers need to like grapple with, whether they are doing it on purpose or not. That is there.
Yeah. I will say that like the average person knows and this is not an excuse by any means, this is just context, but I think the average person knows, or at least the very least the average American,
but they don't know like the racism, but they have like ingrained it because they know like the costumes are magical. They know a lot of the stuff that is that racism. So even if they don't know it on a rational level, they have definitely subconsciously know it. And I feel like that's how the Pretender name created itself. Like I don't think there's other explanation, because it's like a character that has a lot of Romani stereotypes on one on top of another.
Yep.
It's also like super simple to hire.
Yeah.
I was gonna say hire a sensitivity reader. It ain't fucking hard. Or log on to Twitter and read like one amazing thread by somebody laying out all this racism, and it's like, I don't know. I think it takes a willful ignorance in some cases to like construct these types of stories where like, I get that writers don't want to be too informed by the discourse, but also like,
I mean, there's a difference between discourse and like understanding that something that was put out is very harmful. For example, just this past year, we had the issue with what was it, the Hulk comic, which had a very anti-Semitic panel that said like Jewy business and things like that on it, and the only reason that action was taken was because many people pointed out like, wow, how did this get through? Like, okay, the artist drew this, right? The inkers, the colorists, the editors, the publishers, everybody looked at this and just let it go or didn't notice. And there's like some of it is like, I think like you said, there's just like willful ignorance. But boy.
Yeah.
Is there a canonical reason with Magneto why he chose a Sinte identity when he changed his identity? I haven't read those comics in a while, and it's a mix of things. But what is the canonical reason that he chose another oppressed minority?
So I remember correctly, because somebody asked me about this a while ago, it was that he decided to take on the Sinti identity to make it easier to look for Magda.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, that, and then he just sort of kept it, but he had like a forger who like gave him that name. I think eventually got slightly retconned to say oh no, that was just his first name. I think he got from like an uncle or something.
Yeah.
Or like that's the
Mhm.
explanation I remember, at least.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if I remember, his uncle named Erik was in Testament.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna take advantage because I wanna ask you all the next question. But before that, I wanna just drop here because I was asking about comics from Magneto to every one of you, and I wanted yes, that's how we got here. And I wanted, but now it's great. And I wanted to just bring the comics that Zach Rabiroff, who came to the show to talk about identity in the X-Men a while ago. I'll probably drop also that video here because Zach was great, and he also talked about Jewish identity in Magneto, and he recommended some comics, and I want to bring them here to people who want to read the stuff from Magneto. It was the Cullen Bunn run from 2014, I think, and the classic X-Men 12 and 19th.
Mhm.
And those were the issues that I reread for today's show, and those are amazing issues. And I just to bring some recommendations here, and also now I want to ask you all, and this goes with what we were talking about with Magda. I want to ask about Magneto's family because I feel like that's a big part of this character. And some characters that could be included in Magneto's family could be obviously Magda, Wanda, Pietro, and Polaris. I would say Xavier because I have my
Well,
own.
that's his
there,
husband.
but I think yes.
So why
Thank you.
No.
Thank you.
No.
why erase
No.
Erik's husband?
No.
Yeah.
Erase him completely.
So I think one of the family conversation is always really interesting because I feel like the first thing that like gets thrown out in that discourse is like, first off, being a bad father does not make you a bad person. Failing to have the necessary emotional maturity or capacity to raise a child does not make you a shit person. And so many people want to write off the character. We're like, yeah, Magneto is cool, but he's a terrible dad. There are a lot of bad parents, but good people. Like it's more complicated than that.
He also never really got the chance to actually raise a child. Like Anya was
Right.
just a little girl when she was killed. She was maybe 5, maybe 8. Like we don't know exactly how old she was, but she was really little. And then he didn't even know about Wanda and Pietro. And even though he knew them from the Brotherhood, he didn't know they were his children until they were both adults. And same thing with Polaris. So, and a lot of it is due to, I think, writers not knowing how to write those family dynamics or understand how to like actually craft that kind of storytelling. But his the Magneto Maximoff family tree is special. I think it's probably the most complicated, line in all of Marvel.
The Summers family would disagree.
Okay, you're right. You're right. I pretend the Summers don't exist, but that's fair.
I'm hearing Gabriel in my mind saying the Guthries also. Fantastic.
Yeah, but the Summers family transcends time and space quite literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That being said, like you have Wanda and Pietro, and Erik and Pietro, I was rereading some things and I came to the realization that I think the reason Erik and Pietro clash so much is their personalities are actually really similar in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
Right? And I was like, why did I just now realize this? But then again, he's sort of, I think because Magneto never had a family. He had a family for 2 seconds, right? And so I think he's never really gotten the chance to really be able to have that relationship. And there was some of that with Lorna, and then Trial of Magneto happened, and I'm still very confused by most of that. And then you have his yeah, and then you have his interactions with Billy and Tommy. And so I want the return of Grampneto. I really do, because the possibilities and hilarity is infinite.
I I always feel like Magneto as a parent is really difficult to like. He's like a far better elder in the community than he is a parent. And like,
Yeah.
he also demonstrates what is like one of the most common things within like familial structures within marginalized communities, which is like generational trauma plays such a large role in like your ability to be present for your kids. And like we've all said, like he never had a family. Like his childhood experience is enmeshed in this like genocidal trauma, and then he just cycles from one trauma to the next without like anyone ever providing for his emotional needs. So like even under ideal circumstances, like what model would Magneto have to be a parent? Like where would he be drawing those examples from? The only
Does he even remember his own parents anymore?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, depending on the writer.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
A friend of mine a while back who is Jewish and had family who died in the Holocaust, we were talking about Joe Kubert's Yosel, which is a what-if comic about what if his family had not escaped in time and brought him to the States, and he had not had the opportunities he had here, where he was drawing Hawkman at like 14 or whatever. And it's really hard, but their explanation of it made me mad at first. And then I was like, no, they have a point. They said it's like somebody gave Magneto a what if I was human, summer vacation assignment. Because it's this, what if my family couldn't save me and I had to participate, I had to be involved in things directly. And I think Magneto carries that. When we look at Magneto as a parent or as a teacher, we're looking at someone who feels like parents have to be perfect, teachers have to be perfect in a way that he knows he's never going to be. And Magneto,
he's never argued to be either. Like,
yeah,
I don't know who thinks that Magneto's going around telling people he could be a really good parent. Like, he's constantly like, and this is why I love New Mutants when he's the teacher, because like this guy is over his head, and it's very obvious. He's just like, I don't know. It's like, what do you need from me? Do you need me to bomb the UN? I can do that. But like, I can't give you advice on relationships, Sam.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to point out exactly Magneto in New Mutants being a teacher, because there's something like really, because he really, like for me, he really succeeds in some ways, like succeeds by accident, because he's teaching really traumatized, mostly queer, at least for me, mostly queer characters that have repressed those parts of themselves like a lot. And he's like teaching them from his own place of having a very, like, at least subtextually similar experience. And it's like, for me, he feels so much like a queer elder in that book. So much. Like, it's such a big part of his character, because he's like teaching by failing. And that's something that a lot that happens, like when you go to a queer bar and you meet people and you get to like, and you don't know a lot about these things. When you firstly have come out and that stuff, you meet people that are sometimes as messy as you, but that have like you connect in that kind of messy experience. And that's exactly how I see Magneto as a teacher in New Mutants, because I see him being like, I wouldn't even know what to do if I were you. Type of situation with the kids constantly, when he over projects his own depression over the depression of the kids because they died and came back as zombies and all the stuff. And he kind of like, am I making something wrong? Am I like, is my mental disorder affecting these kids? And they're just like mentally ill kids like him, like exactly like him. And it's such a sweet dynamic. Like, I don't know.
Right.
No, go ahead.
That is like, I feel like that's part of like almost what Fossil makes his relationship with his like children also have the potential to be like so like close and like good, also like with that generational trauma that you were talking about, Dani, because I feel like just in general they are like very similar just because they are, but also like by experiencing these kinds of generational traumas, I feel like they would be able to connect over them. It's just that like it takes time to like be able to like not like, I guess, project that trauma and like hurt people with that trauma, and rather use it to be able to understand them and help them through it. I don't know. I just feel like a lot of the times just feel like this could be like a really like strong family if so much hadn't happened.
Well, I think there's a lot. I mean, obviously, because he spent a lot of time as a supervillain, there's a lot of flaw there. There's going to be, but also with contemporary writers, with contemporary handling, there's this bizarre idea that adopted family or step family or just being an adult who is in charge of children or raising children is not the same as if Wanda and Pietro are his biological children. I don't give a fuck if they're his biological children. It doesn't change anything. Even when he didn't think of them as his children, but he thinks of them as, when they're in the Brotherhood, they're canonically about 14, 15. And they're young teenagers. And he canonically would do things like hire humans when they try to run away or escape. He would hire humans to scare them, to make them come back. There's 2 different sequences where he tries to prostitute out Wanda. And not even the dance for my friends thing, which he does separately, but just straight out, you're going to hook up with the submariner and that kind of thing. And so that has to be taken into context. It's still part of their dynamic then as father and daughter, because even if he wasn't thinking of this is my father at that time, they as children are looking at him as a father figure. He is the father figure. He is the parental figure in their life. And that gets weird with a lot of other things that go on. There's a part during one of the Bendis runs where he says, or he implies that Bova wasn't really like there all the time. Bova is something that Scarlet Witch with her powers retroactively made happen, which I think probably sounded real cute to him when he wrote it. But that's really weird, you know, in terms of figuring out their family dynamics and how that works. Like, what does that mean that the woman who took care of them when they were small children wasn't real?
You know, the beauty of, you know, having such a long continuity is that you can ignore the parts you don't like. And those are definitely the parts that I think I definitely would choose to ignore and pretend are not canon. But we all have that one comic book run where we're like, that's not canon. You can't convince me it's canon. And one of those things was like in Axis when they retconned Wanda and Pietro away from being Magneto's children. And the entire X-Men fandom was just like, yeah, that didn't happen. This isn't canon. We're ignoring it. And now we're at a point where it goes to what you were saying, that like it doesn't really matter because they're still the chosen family, and Wanda does see they have an entire conversation in the last issue of Trial of Magneto where Polaris is like, well, you think of Magneto as your father, don't you? And she goes, well, yeah. And she's like, okay, so this is your place. Which to me felt a little bit like they didn't want to retcon their own retcon that they probably should have. But I think it does establish what you're saying, that like it doesn't, to me it matters, but I know for a lot of people it doesn't, and that's okay. That like it's still how they view each other and the familial connections that they have, whether they're biological or not, still matter.
For me, I think it's like, sorry.
So there's a scene in the Genosha Excalibur where early on, and they're trying to figure out why Magneto's alive. And Magneto's like, I don't remember a lot of stuff. I do a lot of things. But the conclusion that Magneto eventually comes to is, let's just say Wanda did it. I think I'm okay with that for a lot of continuity things at this point. Wanda had a bad day. That's what happened.
Yeah, they should use that more often. Honestly.
Well, what was it? Wanda was in prison at one time and just brought back Wonder Man to rescue her because she needed to be rescued. Like,
listen, sometimes you just gotta get it done. Wonder Man.
Do what you have to do.
Yeah.
No one is going to therapy in the X-Men universe, and so Wanda has to do these things.
Lorna did.
there a single mutant therapist? Because the only therapist I
Paige
know of.
Guthrie.
Oh,
Then where is she throughout all
Paige
of
Guthrie
this?
gets her MSW in Christina
she's the only
Strain's.
one.
When I'm
Yeah.
thinking of,
That's
Polaris.
too much to put on one mutant, okay? We need to bring in Doc Samson, bring in Rebecca Kaplan, right? Like, just give all of the therapies.
No problem with, and because you brought up Samson, is that X Factor issue, which I know people love. People love that X Factor issue where they do therapy, and
it ends with a.
I hate that issue, and part of the reason I hate that issue is the Polaris stuff, because Polaris has been through some stuff. She's been sexually abused. She's been beaten. She is in a very fragile state. Her boyfriend there is the biggest asshole. Alex is the biggest white man's burden character by that run, and I can't stand it. And she's in therapy, and her therapist starts making jokes about, well, your powers are magnetic, and you seem to repel and attract men. Fuck you.
That's a terrible therapist.
Samson is a shit therapist.
Oh my god, I take it back. Oh my goodness. Get who's Moon Knight's therapist right now? Get that person. They seem competent.
Competent therapists of the Marvel universe. That's going to be the next Krakoa era book. It's just therapy of X.
That's
Since we're talking about therapy. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's like the good version of Hellion.
Okay, since we're talking about therapy, Magneto is one, I think he's canonically bipolar, if I'm not wrong. And he also has canonically PTSD, but I mean, who doesn't in the X-Men universe?
Yeah, name me one mutant that doesn't have PTSD.
But probably complex PTSD, most probably. And I want to ask you all, Erik has a fantastic video on Magneto and mental illness that I can recommend, that I just plugged for the second time. It's amazing. And I just want to ask you all, how do you see, because I feel conflicted in a way, because Magneto has a lot of problems with that continuity, like we have been talking about for the whole show, and he's written in very different ways on one time and another. And sometimes, especially when I was rereading the Cullenban run, I was rereading that, and I was because the run is trying to reconcile these different characterizations. It's trying to set a light on why someone, and on his position, on why he had to do that, had these actions on him, and trying to reconcile different phases of Magneto. And I feel part of it goes to the root of how mental illness is represented, or more how much of this characterization can we put also on this is a person that is struggling and also has massive powers, because a lot of people that are not struggling don't have massive powers too. Most people that are struggling don't have massive powers.
I think that's always been the really interesting thing for Magneto is.
Oh, real quick. Bye, Anthony.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much
Anthony.
for coming. I couldn't get to your comment to the one that we were talking about Magneto, Xavier, and Gabriel Haller, but we maybe can talk about that later. If we do, I'll let you know. But okay, bye. Thank you so much for coming. Okay, go ahead, Dani.
It's really interesting because when you talk about mental health and Magneto, there are so many different quadrants that you have to kind of hold space for. And I think one of the ways that I've always internally prized Magneto's inconsistent characterization is first off, no one in the world, no human being is as consistent as a character in a story is. So I think it's a really human sign for Magneto to be inconsistent. But you have this you have extreme amounts of generational trauma. You have a very quantifiable form of neurodivergence. You have being part of a multiple intersections of marginalized identities, and then you give him this tremendous power. Your mood, we know that people's mutations are an extension of their interiority. It's an extension of their like internal psychology to some extent. If I had those types of powers, let's be real, like I'm a fairly inconsistent individual. Like I vacillate from like really like measured responses to oppression to just being like, you know what, all trans people should just like start throwing grenades at the White House. Like we really need to just like rise up. I'm sorry for anyone cis out there, but like you've had your time, you've had your chance. It's gonna be. But anyway, like there are those extremes, and I think like for a character with as many different vectors of minority stress and mental health issues that Magneto has, like his inconsistency, I think, can be easily wrapped up in the fact that like minority stress is a acute and chronically felt thing. And so like I think he demonstrates a really interesting model where like, yeah, like there have been times where I've been trying to be on my like New Mutants vibe, like, okay, I'm going to be like really intentional with the way that I engage with like queer youth. I'm going to try to be for them the mentor and the role model that I wished I had. And then there's sometimes where I'm like, listen, cis people, they really don't care about you. So you got to just like fucking fight them wherever you find them. Like give no ground. And like, but you can see how somebody in Magneto's shoes would have as many different extremes from like the most loving and tender side in like Anthony's story to just like, you know what, fuck it, I tried being nice, I'm gonna reverse the poles of the earth, and you know what, we're just gonna deal with it from there because I got nothing else. Nobody else has come to the table.
And like a lot of those shifts are very visible. Like we see him becoming disillusioned with his own way and trying it Xavier's way and being a teacher and being there for children. Then we see kind of the reversal of that again, where it's like, oh, this isn't working. This is not doing enough. I need to, you know, get my shit and, you know, throw some whatever. And so it's interesting seeing those shifts. But I think what's really interesting, and this is like, one of the things the X-Men films did not do a good job of at all is that they never really addressed Erik's trauma. They just sort of like, here's trauma, and here's more trauma, and here's more trauma, and here's more trauma, and here, we're going to destroy Auschwitz, which will totally be cathartic for some stupid reason, which it wasn't. I'm still very offended by that. I will forever be bitter about that. But he's one of those characters that I think is constantly going to be shifting between his own ideals because, Dani, as you said, that's human. And we're constantly, our views on issues change, our positions change because our experiences change. A good experience may shift things to the better. A bad experience may shift things for the worse, or however that might turn out. But this is why I think that, like, look, like I said, Billy Kaplan, his mom is a psychologist. She needs to meet Magneto. If nothing else ever happens in comics, this is the moment that I need, because just imagine a psychologist Jewish mother meeting Magneto. First of all, that's hilarious on so many different levels, but I think that's like a character that would it's just a fun interaction to imagine, because I think Magneto needs a little bit of a Jewish mother somewhere around him. Like, it doesn't have to be his own Jewish mother, right? It just has to be a Jewish mother.
Well, and that's that conversation that I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I see come up a lot in the trans community is like reparenting ourselves as elders, where it's like you arrive at this. I personally went on this internal journey last year. It's like I have like 30, and there are people who now see me as an elder, and I'm like, what does that even mean for me, who like I'm still working through like my trauma? And I realize that there's a process going on where like a lot of queer and trans people are always kind of like reparenting each other, and I do think that like somebody needs to help parent Magneto, because so much ground could be covered if like Magneto just felt safe. And I think that lack of safety has created a sense of urgency, which, like, again, for somebody with his type of letters, PTSD and complex post-traumatic stress, and post-traumatic stress, like, we've never seen a Magneto who felt safe.
Yeah.
We've never seen a Magneto who wasn't under threat, whether it's external or internal. And I think that mix that with a personality to sort of like bipolar 1 or 2. I think Magneto is closer to 1 than he might be to 2. But like that's gonna create a fight or flight response that is on like second to second to second to second. And like
he doesn't know how to live.
Yeah.
I think
no.
that's what that boils down to, is that like he is a character that only knows the fight or flight. And he's under constant, like, I can't imagine being in that head. Like, the pressure that he must put on himself to be the person that he is must be astounding. And so to like, I hope that, you know, with the new Magneto comic, whatever it turns into, has some potential. I know. Like, this is what happens. There's so much potential, and then we just end up being disappointed. But you know, would help to give Magneto sort of a little bit of room, because I think people are constantly trying to like put him in something and make him do a lot of stuff. But like, I think Magneto just needs to be in a moment for just a little bit.
Well,
See, like,
And I think, okay. Okay.
Go.
Okay, well, I just go. I think also it's because it's something that is understated in Magneto's trauma a lot. And I was just thinking about it with what Dani was saying, and with Magneto reading some kind of reparenting, is that, and this is something that I think is not small, is that his view of the world rarely matches the view of the world of the people he loves. And that's one of the main, like, and that's mainly there because of Xavier. Like, the main conflict is how much he loves Xavier and how different they view the world, and how that, like, and because those are bitter as husbands, but like, no, but like, getting seriously, I think that kind of like gets into like, can get deeper into your trauma, because you don't have anyone close to you that really understands you. And there's, in the comic in which he loses his child, and also Magda also hates him in that moment. And I think that type of trauma of having the people that you love be very like against your ideals, or the things that you have rooted deeply in yourself, is not something to be understated. And it's pretty much like pretty understated. Like, we don't get a lot of Magneto reckoning with that. There was some of it in Cullen Bunn's book that I really liked. There were some panels he was reckoning with that, but I feel like that's something that, that Magneto should like, that exploring his reparenting, like having someone that views the world similarly as him on his side, because that's something that we haven't seen. If that makes sense.
I have problems with Howard Chaykin and his work. But separate from that, his Magneto comic, The First X-Man in Brooklyn, I think is a great Magneto, because it's Magneto coming to America for the first time, pre-X-Men stuff. And he's dressed like $1 million. He's moving to Brooklyn. He's got an apartment. This is where Charles is from. He already knows Charles. Like, America is Charles Xavier for him. And he's moving close to Charles. He's in Brooklyn. It's just downstate from, his boyfriend, his husband. And he's so excited, and he's so full of this, I can do this, and we can do this togetherness and unified thing. And the minute he sets down in Brooklyn, it's fucking scary, because there's people all over the place. There's people, and there's rent, and there's communities. And that to me feels like a lot of Magneto. Magneto is afraid of people. He's afraid of other human beings, especially non-mutant human beings, but human beings in general scare Magneto. Responsibility on that level. He is responsible because he's afraid to be responsible for these things. He's not prepared to be what he feels he's expected to be or should be. And so I love the comic for that part of it. It's kind of a very subtle how Magneto becomes a quote unquote supervillain. And it's not because there was a big fight. It's not because he's super jealous of a hero or something, or he's going to steal something and he wants property or money or whatever. It's because the world is scary and he's got to reconcile with that. He has to learn to operate within the world. And a way to do that is to lash out at stuff and to start living in satellites in outer space or castles that you've conquered, because that is more comfortable than paying rent in Brooklyn.
I mean, anything is cheaper than paying rent in Brooklyn by comparison. But
No, this is it.
I was about to say Brooklyn rent is. I would throw a comment at the planet over it.
Yeah.
Like again, it's a lot. I think it's interesting though what you were saying about something within that triggered like my thinking about relationships that Magneto has formed. And thinking, I'm so surprised that we don't talk more right now in this podcast about Erik and Charles, especially with Erik on the podcast.
I've been like bursting with things to say for like I don't
Yes.
know.
Go ahead.
Just
go
go.
ahead.
Just go.
Just go.
One thing. Someone mentioned like the X-Men movies, and I thought it was so interesting because that's like what I base my video off of, and it's like so interesting because especially in First Class, there's like so much there, but it's what we were talking about with the comics. There's potential, but it doesn't always go all the way through. Because I feel like after that, after First Class, they're just like, let's keep piling up the traumas, but we're not really gonna like talk about that or anything. Like we're over that, and it's like, wait. But I think with going back to comics, like his inconsistency definitely, like you were saying, like is connected to like mental illness. But I think in specific, I think when it comes to complex PTSD or a personality disorder, I think that really comes in, and that the sense when you have a personality disorder, it's like your literal being is literally disordered. So knowing who you are, what you're going to do, all of that is like very disordered and very like connected to what is happening outside of you. It's like you are living like like eternally in reaction rather than like anything like really like you know? And I saw like a meme recently that was like, just found out my entire personality is a trauma response. And that reminded me of Erik, but also of Lorna in a sense. Because they kind of have similar experiences in some ways of kind of just like not being able to exist as themselves and be safe, as they were talking about, and more just like continuously being in a state of chaos. Yeah, and
I think it also
Erik.
gets at like, I think it's
go on.
interesting because that also speaks to something about Erik's personality. I've always said that there is Erik and then there's Magneto, and like we don't see Erik very often. I think one of the most recent times we've seen Erik is like in Ewing's it was like 3 panels between Scarlet Witch and Erik, where like Erik is just like sitting there sadly drinking scotch, and I'm like, yeah, that is Erik. But then there's Magneto, and I think Magneto is this like truly performative persona for him, and I think that's so interesting that we're talking about like Magneto has really styled himself as a reaction to the world around him, because even just the semiotics of like how he holds compositional space in panels, Magneto never enters the panel. Well, I shouldn't say never because someone's gonna at me or whatever, but he so often enters panels in full frame. The cape is billowing, metal shit swirling around. Like Magneto's entrances.
It's usually with a big Magneto with like a strong lettering to it.
Yeah. Well, and
it always looks so menacing anytime you don't just say Magneto on like typical print. You do the whole like stylization. It does, like, because it's meant to be intimidating, because Magneto is an intimidating figure if you don't know anything about him.
Yeah, if you don't know Erik, which is also like why Magneto is the villain in so many stories, but Erik is like this like tender, traumatized child at the bottom of it all. And like, I think that like the best use, and I've said this and it's not hyperbole, but I'm sure there's plenty of other reads. The best use of Magneto since Hoxpox was those few panels with Scarlet Witch, where it's like, we don't know what's on his mind, but like we as the readers who like, if you have read Erik's history, like you know that like he's probably just so deep in like emotional turmoil, in some form of self-loathing, in some form of like dramatic response to whatever the most recent debate him and Charles have had, that it's just like, I loved seeing that. I loved seeing, oh my God, everyone's leaving.
No,
It's like,
no,
oh,
no.
okay, okay.
There's a time
They
shift.
turn
This
in the
nonsense,
lights
you know?
on.
No,
Yeah.
I get it.
You have to make sure you can see our beautiful faces.
Hi.
I just saw your shirt, Erica. That's so good.
Yeah, I love it.
I forgot what I was saying. But yeah, Magneto is performative. That's it. It's a performance, literally.
Definitely.
I feel.
But I think Magneto, like you're talking about when he's drinking scotch, and I feel like Magneto self-medicates a lot. When you look at the power enhancement stuff with Magneto, scenes of Magneto drinking, because when he's teaching the New Mutants, he's like bottle of scotch on the desk, Lou Grant guy, while he's teaching. The Morrison run where he's addicted to kick. And I think Magneto is terrified of doctors. I think Magneto doesn't get vaccinated. When you look at
Nathaniel Essex worked at Auschwitz. Like, yeah, probably has some reasons to fear a doctor.
That's what I'm saying. Is he's.
But also, if I'm sorry, if you're a virus, would you want to attack Magneto? Because like that sounds like a death sentence for anything.
I think at the same time, you will never see Magneto say mutants can't get AIDS. Like he's not a truther in any form at all. But when he flips out on Moira, because when he was a baby, Moira medicated him for his medical disabilities. Like he was a baby, he was a toddler. That's what a doctor's raising you and you're a baby and you have a medical issue. They're gonna give you medicine. That's gonna happen. But he is so pissed off about it that he will pull her up from the earth into outer space in, the pool house or whatever. And they have he goes to war with the X-Men over essentially that. You medicated me when I was a baby. I'm going to go to war with the earth. And I think the UN get involved in that. I fully feel that through his whole characterization. He is not going to go to a doctor and get seen by a doctor and get taken care of. He's going to drink a couple of glasses of whiskey and say that he doesn't have a cough anymore.
He's going to walk it off.
That one time with Dr. Nemesis in this is like Uncanny X-Men 500 something. This is like the prologue to Children's Crusade. Where I guess after a battle on the desolate wasteland that is Genosha, because that's what it is now, Erik wakes up and he's been patched up, and Dr. Nemesis is like, you're not strong enough to get up and do stuff, and he's like, you don't tell me what to do. And that's when he learns about Billy and Tommy. But it's hilarious because Dr. Nemesis is like, don't do the thing. And what does Erik do? He goes and he lifts the metal tower or whatever it was. He's like, I'm fine. Ah!
Well, and Nemesis was a Nazi. Nemesis was a Nazi. So, yeah, you have a Nazi doctor telling Erik not to do something.
I find it interesting how many Nazi doctors are mutants.
How does he not just drop buildings on them every day is my whole thing. Like, say it happened. Like, I don't think I did it. That building must have been built wrong.
Yeah.
It's continuity comics things. Like sometimes it'd be like that.
There's a Chumbawamba quote probably somewhere in there, but
I mean, the politeness politics of Krakoa have to be so difficult to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
I still find it weird they somehow managed to kind of like quote unquote reform Apocalypse, but also not reform Apocalypse. And then like it's so weird.
Reform within the context of a sorry, Duna.
No.
Like with
I'm trying to put on track.
Sorry.
Duna is literally herding cats right now.
Yes, back to Magneto.
Okay.
I was gonna say something about I think someone mentioned Charles and Erik, and I was gonna say something about them as I always do. But I think it's like really interesting, the people that he loves are like not on his side thing. And I think like with Charles it's so interesting because it's like I feel like Erik is both like repulsed and very attracted to Charles's like endless like hope and slash like naivety, whatever.
Yeah, you're right. You got it.
Like it's like that is like something that's the complete opposite of himself, and kind of just like this belief in like a world that he like secretly vies for. Like Charles believes that he can make the world safe or something, and that's what Erik wants, but also like he can't live like that. Like he needs to do his like fight and flight thing. He can't do what Charles is doing. And I also just think that like even like beyond that, like the political difference between them, like while it does like drive a whole lot of X-Men storylines, and while like it definitely drives like their major conflict, I think that that part like kind of has nothing to do with whether or not they like or love each other, because you know the whole like bookends of the same soulmates thing. It's kind of like that, and also in this way of like you're the only motherfucker in this town that could handle me or something like that. Like
It's
kind
very
of
much
whole,
the
like yeah.
nobody gets to kill you except me.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're like the only ones like on each other's level, not in like a like I mean, I was gonna say not in like a like they think they're like the best people, but like yes they do. They're kind of like they're both quite pretentious about each other, and they might have like a reason to feel that way, but it's annoying.
When
I think that's really that's really well represented in a comic that we have talked about a couple of times today, Uncanny X-Men 200, because there's this moment in which Charles is supposedly like dying, and they have like this very homoerotic tension at the same time, and they are like facing each other and like this very intimate moment, and Charles is like, "You're gonna take care of my children." Could be anyone. It couldn't be anyone but you. Only you can take care of those children that I'm taking care of, because you're the only person that I trust that much. And I think that's one moment that reflects like how much, even if they have like this massive political tension, they have like also a deep like care and extremely intimate bond with each other that transcends a lot of things. And I guess that I can see why that drives like Erik like to a point where he can understand it, because he's very attached to his ideals. Like a very important part of Erik is how he thinks about the world. So having his most intimate relationship with someone that doesn't think like him is like it would kill me. Like I would be suffering.
I think though that you see this sometimes in like real world relationships formed with like people of Erik's type of experience, like who've been exposed to these really traumatic, chronic situations. And so I've always seen that as like a lot of like wish fulfillment for Erik, where like, you know, to put it simply, opposites attract, but to like expand on it a little bit more, like Erik, like Charles represents a worldview that Erik desperately, I think, wants to work towards. And like, there's something really utopian about Charles's worldview. And I think that so much of that attraction for Erik might be, and this might be me projecting, is like, Charles is capable of a form of engaging with the world that Erik was robbed of. He was robbed of that kind of like innocence to say like, maybe not everyone is an obstacle. And I think that so much of that is Erik trying to reclaim a part of maybe his own internal innocence that has been sort of over time eroded and, you know, I think that, not that that's always in the text, but I think the two of them operate really strongly in that way when you look at the grander scheme of things, where it's like, you know, Charles, I really wish everything was the way you say it is, and I like love you for that, but you know, mutants are dying, so if you need me, I'll be, you know, terrorizing New York real quick.
I think, you know, I look at, especially in that long view, how much of Magneto is Erik's gift to Charles, because Charles would look so much worse if there wasn't a Magneto.
So true.
World Army, you know, upstate, and playing international teams. Is this, you know, there's a lot going on, and if you don't have someone like Magneto in opposition to that, and if you don't have somebody like Magneto pushing the other side of engagements, all you have is a rich white guy in upstate New York who has a child army in tight clothes.
And that does tend to look bad if you don't have, say, somebody who's taken over all of Manhattan with a military occupation. So you need scale.
Especially early on, a lot of those Magneto actions really do look like somebody who wants Charles' attention, wants the X-Men's attention.
Oh, yeah, he's trying to impress.
Yeah. I mean, they're not really there to like get other people's attention.
It's getting cocky there.
So much of X-Men in like, I feel like up until maybe the Morrison era was like sectarian politics, where it's just like, here are two different leftist organizations. It's not necessarily about the struggle that they're united against. It's more about like, how many times can they throw shade at each other in the same organizing meeting before things break down? And it's like,
but what I really loved about some of the like animated cartoons and what some of the movies one of the movies hinted at was like the idea of the two ideologies coming to a head when recruiting children for their various causes. Like, come join me. I have a school where I'm going to train you to death and hope you don't die. And like, come with me. We're going to live on the run and do a lot of criminal things, but we're going to fight for the mutant cause. Like, who do you pick in that scenario? Like, can I just stay home with a tutor who'll teach me how to use my powers and then I'll go to college?
And you look at the adults who joined either side early on, especially, they're the most dysfunctional adults. The functional adults, Blob was like, I have a job. Like, Blob has a home and a job. He doesn't need either side. But Mastermind is a mess. Mastermind signs up totally. He's like, there's a teenage girl involved in this. That's Mastermind's whole thing in the 60s, is perving on Wanda. Toad is a mess. When we look
at least that's still consistent.
Amelia Voigt has come back, right? She was a Sword. Is she anywhere else right now?
Mentioning Toad just sent me into Trial of Magneto.
That's where I went, yup.
Okay. Do you all want to talk about Trial of Magneto?
Yes.
Because we could. Spoilers, it's not really about Magneto.
He's on the cover.
Trial of Magneto.
It's both like not about Magneto, but also about Magneto. Like, it not being about Magneto makes it about Magneto.
Yeah.
Very Derridian, yeah.
I have to find it because I decided to rename the comic and I gave it a different name when I reviewed for the last issue, and I don't remember what it was that I chose, but it was something like The End of the Great Pretender, because at the end of the day, it's not the trial of Magneto, it's the mental turbulations of Wanda. And it has a happy, and like the whole thing still, it started out really, really strong, right? The first issue was relatively solid, and then it just went,
yeah.
And the ending, unfortunately, doesn't make and do not get me started on the mischaracterization of Wanda's air quote children. Because that was all over the place, and that made no sense from a continuity perspective. And like, I reviewed all of the issues on Comics Watch, so if anybody wants to read them, have at it. But there's a lot I didn't put into the reviews because it would have just been too ranty and too much. But I think it had a lot of potential to seal the rift between Erik and his children, whether biological or not. It had the potential for somebody to finally stand up to the council and tell them off. It had so much potential. And the only thing that it managed to do was just ends with like the resurrections of new mutants whose coding we don't have to resurrect them, basically, which is like awesome, cool. You just undid M Day permanently, but like there's still issues here.
Yeah, and on top of like all that, like it's like either like the problems like between like Magneto and like his family are either like super huge and glaring, or they're like completely omitted. Like with Pietro, he just disappeared. We don't know where Pietro is. He's lost. But I also think like between Erik and Lorna, terrible. It was
what
terrible.
I have a genuine question. What was with that dialogue? It felt so
It was crazy.
It was petty. It was childish. It felt like it felt a little bit like, you know, when you have a kid and they don't really know how to write fights between characters that know and love each other. It felt so petty and so weirdly worded. And I just went like, wait, is this how a father like, you know, we've all seen parents and children fight on TV, right? And it's written in dramatically. And then you have this moment and I'm just like, what is this?
And it made no sense.
No
like,
sense.
Lorna being like blaming him for like the death of his wife and young child.
Well, and it's also like Lorna has like, it's interesting that you mentioned that like the things about the kids that they do and do not choose to engage with is so wild to me. Like, if Lorna wants to be pissed at Erik, we could go back to the end of the Cullen Bunn run where like he literally just hangs out with her to power sap her for a solid 15 minutes midair. And he just kind of lets her drop. And like if Lorna wanted to be indignant with Magneto, there were so many other things that could have been potentially brought in. And then what was, it's like one of these things where I think like I always take issue in movies where like a character tells me that character development has taken place. And you see this like very commonly where a montage had to be cut somewhere where it's like, I've grown a lot since the last time we've met. And it's like, we have not seen that. And like a lot of what the kids and like the grandkids are reacting to is like a version of Wanda and Magneto that we haven't really seen. But also like if we have seen it, it's not being named. So a lot of it just feels like tension for the sake of narrative. But not in a way that was like
most of it. Most of the fight scenes were just tension for the sake of tension, or it felt like the fights were just there to sort of distract us from the plot. Where it was like, oh, we're gonna have these characters interacting for 2 seconds. Oh, look, there's a kaiju.
Yeah.
Well, this had been pitched as an arc in ongoing. It wasn't pitched as a mini. It wasn't pitched as an event. And I know they've talked about the writers talked about editorial was very hands-on in terms of removing it from an ongoing and making it an event. And so I feel like some of that artificiality and some of that we need to fight now, that's because other ongoing characters in an ongoing title would have been filling those pages. It feels like they ripped a subplot out of an arc and made it an event. And then you have Billy saying things like, I've defended you all my life.
Oh, don't get me started.
No one knows. From what?
Like, from when? You've met her like 4 times in the last like 10 years of continuity.
Maybe
like,
Billy is like really active on blogs and we just don't.
But even then, the only time we've actively seen Billy defend Wanda in anything was in Children's Crusade. That's it. And there's this whole thing of like, you're my mom and our entire lives. And I'm like, you didn't even know she was your mom until you were 16 years old. What the heck? You have parents. They're literally the most perfect parents in comics.
It was very, it feels like they ripped it out and they filled it up with other stuff and they're trying to shoot at this broad audience. There is no broad audience. There is no new, fresh, I've never read a Wanda story. I've never read a Billy story audience reading Trial of Magneto. But that's who they're shooting for. They're trying to like set up a diorama of these characters and a fresh start. And no one's coming in with a fresh start for this. All of us came in with preconceived ideas. All of us came in with a history with these characters.
It also retreads so much ground for Wanda that was taken on in her solo, and like as somebody who really appreciates that series for what it tried to do with Wanda's character, it was imperfect. Why was Captain America there? Many questions, no answers. But it really felt like it tried to pull all the bits out of that and like sprinkle that on this story as like, okay, for anyone who didn't read that, we're gonna create like a sampler platter of what that run was up to for Wanda, and we'll put it here because this is a story about Wanda now.
There was a lot of missing, and I think the context that you provided was really helpful about kind of like how it is, why it came out to be the way that it did. And what's really interesting, because this is building off a lot of other comics, right? It's building off stuff that happened at the gala. It's building off X Factor. And it's interesting that the characters that had the most interesting story in this comic was arguably North Star and Kyle. Like they're like whatever the heck they were doing this entire time seemed way more interesting than the kaiju fight. But even then, like again, like it started off well, and then just
issues 1 and 2 were strong, and like issue 1 and 2 gave me a different picture of what this series was going to be, and then
it was like giving like very much like this is a detective story, like this is going to be a mystery, but then it just was like now the Avengers are here
and then Wanda's alive.
I mean, and like it says something that the most exciting question or the most exciting moment that came out of it was like, how the fuck does Kyle know Captain America? Like that's the most exciting part about the 5 issues to me so far. It's like, did they fuck?
I just want to see Cap at that dinner table now. Like I think it needs to happen. But I wish there was like a moment, and I think part of like maybe it was because they cut issues and there weren't enough tie-ins, but there's a lot that was left unexplained. Like how did they make such a big deal in other tie-ins about like, oh, Billy doesn't know what's going on, and oh, Billy feels like something's wrong, and then Billy just randomly shows up, and because I guess the intergalactic phone call Tommy kept trying to connect with finally went through. Like I don't know. And it had potential to tell a really good familial story. And there were some things I really loved in the last issue. That beautiful moment between Lorna and Wanda, which we haven't seen since like the Lorna era X Factor, whichever like 3, volume 3 at this point, or 4 or whatever it was, which was really good. But it sort of felt like a very rushed and very inconsistent ending for something that had a lot of potential. But
it also had nothing to do with Magneto's character advancement.
None whatsoever.
Which, like, even if they had marketed it as a story about Wanda, I would have been like really far less disappointed. But like I was so enticed by the scene where like Magneto is just like crushing Charles's head in the helmet, and I'm like, okay, we're gonna see like Erik. We're gonna see Erik's actual feelings about the shit that goes on around him.
Nope.
Because he's finally reacting in a way that like Erik would react to some of these situations, and like him walking,
like the fact that he like harmed Charles in that instance, just like it kind of like it without saying anything, like tells you like how much this is affecting like him, like the death of Wanda.
That was such a satisfying scene, though. Oh,
yeah.
It harkened back to the fact that like Charles had the chance to really figure out a way to help Wanda before House of M happened, and he's also not a good therapist.
He's also not a therapist.
Exactly.
Not licensed.
But ultimately, it didn't like the comic. It would have been cool to see him really make a case for resurrecting Wanda, which we see fragments of, right? And it's interesting who actually votes to resurrect Wanda. It's Kitty and Nightcrawler, arguably the characters on the council that have interacted with Magneto the most. And then, who votes, and I guess like Storm was sort of, I think, a really interesting wild card because she could have gone either way, but then ultimately votes against resurrecting Wanda, which again, like with all of the things that have happened with Wanda, either decision she made would have made sense. But ultimately, there's a lack of emotional payoff for Magneto, and it ends up becoming more about redeeming Wanda, which was necessary. But if that's where you were going with, like Dani said, then call it the Trial of Wanda, call it the Great Pretender X-Men, but don't call it the Trial of Magneto if there's no trial. And there's not that much Magneto either.
Yeah, it was redeeming Wanda for the third time. no, that. But yes, what are you gonna say, Erik?
Oh, I think even in like hearing that it was supposed to be an X Factor storyline, I also don't feel like this story is something that should have been an X Factor, certainly not as a subplot. I feel like something like of this like gravity, like, you know, the death of Scarlet Witch, this thing has been building over time, needed to be its own thing, but not like this. And it's like X Factor like shouldn't have been canceled to accommodate it. I think that I don't know, because like on one hand,
Marvel,
it's like,
by the way, for that.
Yeah, it's like
I mean, that last issue though.
Oof, yeah, it's it's a lot. But I guess it would have been strange for X Factor to be going on at the same time that X Factor was like investigating a whole other thing. But it could have been almost like an X of Swords kind of event. Like everybody is engaging with this in their own way.
That would have been cool.
Yeah, like,
and they marketed it the same amount that Ten of Swords was marketed. So I expected every other issue to be touching on it, and it was like it was one line in X-Men where like they're teasing Lorna, be like, "Did you kill your sister?" And
it's like,
yeah, I thought there would be more of that, especially because like at the end of the comic, they tell you like, oh, this is like the other upcoming issues. Like, oh, so I need to read these issues to understand what's going to be happening in the next issue. And the answer was, no, you really don't. This is just whatever we have coming that week.
Yeah.
Whatever we have coming that week is a really good summary of Trial of Magneto as well, I think. It's just...
Well, I think the major frustrations that were voiced with Wanda, with Erik, with Lorna are the same frustrations that we've all understood implicitly for a long time. And they didn't come to any kind of head. They didn't come really to anything. And that's a problem with the line as a line, the X line, is that we have these frustrations, these clear political and ideological issues, these representational issues that I think the audience is completely on board with. At least in acknowledging, even if they don't agree with them, they acknowledge that they exist, that these frustrations exist. But the books just won't deal with them. They'll bring them up.
It lacks
it's mentioning it is enough.
I'm going to put everyone who is in grad school in a position of trauma right now, but it's all abstract and literally no thesis.
Yeah.
That's what all of Krakoa has been in a way so far, but specifically Trial of Magneto is like, yes, here's your premise, great, please defend. And it hasn't said that yet.
Yeah,
and it reminds me of
like sorry.
The end of go ahead.
Erik and then Travis.
I'm sorry. I was just gonna say that I feel like actually forgot what I was gonna say. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that there are comics, and there have been great comics that are remembered very well because they just spent a large number of pages letting characters vent or letting events happen. And for anyone who's ever read the manga Akira, it goes on and on for character interaction politics, but the last, like literally like the last 80 pages are just destruction. Because at that point, that's what you want to see. You just want to see God smack the city away in a way. There are emotional denouements that we have to be able to feel as audiences. And that includes for the X comics. There are certain things where they're really playing with identity politics and the treatment of minorities. And Krakoa, that's been their selling point. Their selling point on Krakoa has been how this is when minorities take care of themselves. This is when a community takes care of itself. Let's see it. Let's see it just once. And I think that emotional, that dam needs to break at some point.
I try not to compare things to Evangelion too often because, like, as a trans woman on the internet, I know what that looks like. But the thing is, like, I think you want these like big moments. Like for me, the kaiju scene in Trial of Magneto had so many problems, but like it was so unearned because like I'm not gonna get into the alphabet there, but like the reason you get really big, intense scenes of like cool animation and violence in Evangelion is because like you have 3 episodes straight of like Shinji just sitting around feeling like a complete dipshit. And like the scene, like the whole episode where he's just like in a scene on a train in his mind, just like reflecting on his trauma, the relationship he has with his father. It's a whole, you get all of the time in the world you need to have your vegetables. And then the very next episode is all cake and ice cream. And like, if Trial of Magneto wanted to give you cake and ice cream before you had the chance to be like, these are the stakes, these are the emotional things that everyone is bringing to these fights. And instead it's like, okay, Erik is mad, Wanda's alive, the kids are pissed with a question mark. Here's a big fight that you can't understand anyone's emotional investment in right now. Like, I don't know why anyone wanted to win that fight. Like,
well, like at the beginning, the first fight makes sense, right? Because Magneto's like, no, I didn't kill Wanda. And everybody's like, oh, you killed Wanda. You have to come and like plead your case. And I was like, oh, okay, so we're going to do this. And then Magneto fights them. And then that doesn't go anywhere. And then the Avengers shows up and then they fight Magneto and that doesn't go anywhere. And then Wanda comes back and then like, oh, cool, Wanda's back. And then there's a kaiju and we forget about everything else. And it's just sort of this like tit for tat that it sort of felt like somebody was telling them that like, it's sort of like in Power Rangers, right? Like there's a fight scene and then there's like a monster fight scene, right? And it's all very formulaic. That's how the comic felt. It's almost like they were somehow obligated to have this like 2 bits of emotion followed by a giant fight scene that takes on the rest of the pages.
It's structured a lot like the MCU.
Oh!
We're going to give you 25 minutes of the characters telling you what they think is going on, and then they're going to fight, and then they're going to come together for a like it literally, again, this is the Disney's X-Men. It works on a formula that they've seen perform in one genre or one medium, and trying to see if it can work in 5 issues of comics.
Well, I think even the 80s trial of Magneto during the Avengers X-Men mini, it goes the same way. And that was severely rewritten at the end because they were going to have an actual court decision about Magneto. And higher ups at Marvel were suddenly like, if you do that, it's definitive. It's a judgment. And so it's rewritten so that it's very conflicting. Did they have their minds altered when they made that decision? There's all sorts of, and Magneto busts out and is like, I'm not listening anyway. And so it was structured to preserve that conflict. And I think this mini the same way, it's structured to preserve exactly the same conflicts it brought up rather than resolve or progress anything.
I would have loved actual trial too. Like
In
preparation, I did so much legal research in preparation for a story I did not get to write an essay about. So like, it would have been so fun to see like a courtroom drama, like on Krakoa, like a Phoenix Wright style courtroom drama with like, it's big, it's pulpy, it's campy, and it's exactly what a story about like, it's as if you want to indict a character like Magneto, and like it should be larger than life court proceedings, like.
And Magneto should be evidence, more than almost anything, that X-Men fans will sit through a Talking Heads comic as long as they make dramatic gestures while they talk.
Literally all I show up for in comics is like, okay, the fight, that's cool. I want like 7 pages of Magneto just like calling Charles a dumbass.
That's it.
Like I want,
yes, please.
like I just want. That's why I show up to the X-Men is. I want to chew on something for so much longer than anyone reasonably should in a comic.
Like, give me that, like, anthropological, like, sociological stuff about the mutants in Krakoa and all that. I will gladly sit through, like, 30 pages of just, like, Krakoa political discourse. Like,
like X-Men 4, when they go to the Davos summit, like,
yes,
the best use of Magneto since Hoxpox was that issue where it's like, yes, this is what Magneto does. Magneto does a lot of things really well, but Magneto shines when he's just like, you're a dumbass, and I'm going to tell you exactly why, and there's nothing you're going to do about it. So you just sit there and listen. And it's like, it's beautiful. It's Magneto works best when you're not sure if like he's quoting poetry or not. Like, like it should be big and grandiose. And Trial of Magneto is like, not only is Magneto not really there, but like he really has been simmered down quite a bit.
He's ineloquent. Like he's kind of like the way that he acts, and even in sometimes is drawn in like a lot of those issues is just so, because like we have the whole like, you know, megalomaniac Magneto, right? But when he is that, like he's like giving like Shakespeare performance, like you understand why Ian McKellen played Magneto kind of thing. But in
he's
this,
a performative character. He's operatic in a literal sense. Like,
and so it felt really weird, and I also kind of felt like almost like it was against Magneto in a way.
This was not written by somebody who likes the character very much.
Yeah, definitely. Oh my god. Truest words have never been spoken until that moment.
Or who possibly has read much of Magneto in a sympathetic light.
Well, that's like, I always feel weird because I am like the most anti-Magneto fan.
You have to be anti-Magneto to appreciate him, though. I always say this, like, the best things about the character are also why he just fucking sucks. Like,
constantly, like, Magneto is always wrong, except when he's right. When he's right, he's getting it wrong.
Well, when he's right, he's not a good. The best thing is, like, Magneto is right. He's not good.
He's not good. He's not good at. I don't think he's. Well, I would say he's not
being
good.
Correct does not necessarily make one good. It just makes one correct.
Well, it's not even like morally correct. He's just right within a circumstance of like, yeah, like this may not be the best thing to do, but within our context, like, what's the alternative, Charles?
There's a scene in New Mutants when he's their teacher, and I forget which New Mutants, but two of them come to him, and it's about the Hellfire Club stuff. And they're like, I'm really angry. I'm really mad that you're palling around with Hellfire Club and they've been funding Sentinels and all this. And he's like, you should be really mad about that.
Yeah, he's like, fuck. He's like, fuck me, right?
It's not like you should be mad and I'm ashamed. There's no, you should be mad and I'm going to change. You should be mad. We should have a fight. He's like, yeah, that should make you really mad.
I love that.
And that's very different than, you know, Charles or Emma or any of the teacher figures, basically, who will all kind of do this. Well, I maybe should have a change of heart, or maybe we should, or very defensive. Like he's not even defensive in that circumstance. He's just like, yeah, you should be mad about that.
Yeah,
Charles, and he's all. Oh, go on.
I was just say he's a character who's like always. He's never going to lie about when he's compromising. And I think that that's really like admirable. He's like, this may not be like the best thing to do, but like somebody hasn't tried this yet. So I'm going to. It might be a bad idea, but I can't say he's somebody who says, I can't say that I haven't tried it very frequently as like, you know what, I'm going to give this a go because no one else is going to do it right now. And if this was the thing that worked, I wouldn't want to not have done it.
Yeah.
I have a weird question. Go ahead.
No, I still had one question more, but since we're like more than 2 hours, I feel like I'm just dropping a bomb if I ask another question.
Drop it away.
Okay, I just want to ask you all real quick what you all want for Magneto right now.
I want Magneto on Marauders more than anything else, and my Marauders pitch is that Danny Lore should be writing it. If you want to understand why, go to my Twitter. I've ranted about this so frequently, but I think that I would love to see Magneto on Marauders, a team that is like specifically focused on like subverting established structures of Krakoan policy, and I think that that's where he's like most naturally. I think that that's where there's more ground to explore with him. That isn't a retread of some of the other crap that we've seen him do in the past 2 years.
for me, I think you guys already have a picture of kind of what I want. Is like, I think Magneto, I want to see an actually Jewish story around Magneto that actively says the words Jew in it. Like, you know how hard it is for a comic to use that word? Apparently very difficult for some reason, unless you're being anti-Semitic. That being said, I think there's a lot of room and potential for Magneto to connect with his grandsons, quote unquote, to really establish his Jewish identity. And I think right now, Anthony Oliveira, who was, commenting here, he would be a great writer to tackle that. And I just want to see a little bit more Jewish representation in comics, please.
Personally, oh man, there's so much, but I think I definitely want to. I just want to see. I want to see what I wanted to see from Trial of Magneto, which is to say, I wanted to see something about the Magnus family. Like I want them to progress. I want Erik and Pietro and Wanda and Lorna and Billy and Tommy and fuck Luna, who was like, where is she?
On the moon or somewhere with the Inhumans again for now.
On the moon
probably.
and never aging. But I just want something. I want something along that, something that can like give them a new like kind of normal for like what their relationship is like. I want it to be less broken, and I want those things like focused, like you were talking about like Jewish identity and Roma identity and all those kinds of things, to like really get into like the marginalization aspect and the trauma and all of that. And I don't know if that will ever happen. I don't know. I'm writing about it. Maybe one day it will come to fruition. But and I think like beyond that, I don't know. I just want to see more Erik and Charles stuff on the page, which I got with Inferno. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if like making Chariot canon will happen in any other couple years, especially if this is Disney's X-Men.
It's as likely as anything else happening, which is to say very small for us. It just takes one artist to slip like a ring on a wedding band on both their fingers and we're done.
True. Next time they do a floor plan, they just have a door between their apartments and the fandom will accept.
Yeah.
That's all it really takes.
Isn't that what literally happened with the Summers, Jean, and Wolverine triangle?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I absolutely believed that was a whole thing because Twitter kept telling me it was a thing. And then I got to it.
To be fair with that, it's not established that they're not a triad because we haven't seen Cyclops and Wolverine actually get together. But we need that. But we have seen Jean involved with Wolverine and with Cyclops, and we have seen proof that it's consensual. That part of it is canon. It's not the fans making it up.
So for Magneto coming up, I would really like to see Tidal Waves and Hand of God, and I would like most of all to see Magneto's mouth just go off a lot. I was just recently on very heavy muscle relaxants. I had a bad fall, and it reacts on your nerves. And so I wrote differently, I spoke differently. And when I came off of them, my Twitter, my Facebook lit up with very incendiary political posts the minute I was like 2 hours after being off of them. I was like, oh yeah, I'm angry at shit.
I thought you were saying you wanted Magneto on muscle relaxers, which that would be a really fucking good comic.
I feel like right now, that's what I feel like. I feel like Magneto's being medicated somehow on Krakoa, and he's just drinking whiskey and drinking tea and feeling very, settled. But something's going to set him off, and his mouth's just going to go off. And once it goes off, he's going to keep saying stuff. And that's what I want to see. I want to see a Magneto who doesn't sit quietly while stuff in the same panel is going on, while they're bringing out Nazis to celebrate, or while they're doing these things that just character-wise, he should have an issue with. He's never been a quiet character. If he's a quiet character right now, we need to have a reason. in story why he's quiet right now. Is he just feeling really old? Is he feeling really tired? Does the whiskey make him sleepy? You know, explain it if you're going to do it. Otherwise, he needs to be the reactionary character.
I think something like that, like maybe coming up. I think I saw some kind of like advertisement for like, it was like something like Magneto's leaving the Quiet Council or something like that. Like read to figure out why. I'm not sure which run that's supposed to be, but I think it's supposed to be part of Destiny of X. So I'm hoping that pushes him in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's Immortal X-Men. I think. Yeah, Gabriel just commented that it's Immortal X-Men. Okay, my wish is that 2 years from now, we have a panel like this one, but we're interviewing Anthony Oliveira about his Magneto comic. Like, that's my wish. Because I feel like
we can get there. We can get there.
Yeah, because I feel like the things that you all said about like a book exploring like his family relationships and fully exploring his Jewish identity in relationship to his trauma, instead of just like making it like Sasha just put it super great. Instead of making it one scene, put it like in a greater context, put it into his day-to-day life. I feel like we need that, and I feel like kind of Marvel should be more brave to do books that deal with like everyday life, because fans like them. It's not like the X-Men fan are not gonna get to that. So that's my wish, and yeah. And okay, so thank you all for coming so much for coming today. For real, I had so many more stuff that I would have like. I still had more stuff about Magneto that I would like to have talked with you all. But
there's always next time.
We can always do a next time, like for real. And yeah, thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Dani, a lot. And thank you, Travis, for like accompanying me in this too. And well, I hope I see you all soon in another panel. And thank you everyone who came to the comments as well. Bye.